Hello, I'm Jack Whitehead, and it's the 7th of April 2014, and I'm here in Philadelphia in the USA on the last day of the American Education Research Association, where I've been giving two presentations which focus on living educational theory. And I just want to outline just a little of the history of the emergence of the idea of a living educational theory for the Educational Journal of Living Theories. Now, when I began my studies of educational research, they began literally with my very first lesson that I taught in the East End of London in 1967, when I came out of my very first lesson and I thought I wasn't communicating my understanding of science to my students. Now, I was a science teacher, but I could see that I was actually missing them. I was not engaging them. And I went home that night and I thought, I must do this better. And my key question was, well, how do I improve what I'm doing? And that question has actually remained with me as a fundamental question, a bedrock of my educational inquiries. Now, soon after I started teaching, I registered at the Institute of Education of London University in 1968 for a part-time course in the philosophy of education. And I was really fascinated by the idea that educational theory was constituted by the philosophy, the psychology, the sociology, the history of education. And I studied with one of the people who developed that idea, called Richard Peters, who at the time defined this approach as the disciplines approach to educational theory, and I think for obvious reasons. Now, after I got the academic diploma in the philosophy and the psychology of education, I moved on to the master's degree in the psychology of education, and it was in 1971 when I was actually a science teacher and I was the head of science at Erkenwald Comprehensive in London that I began to question the validity of this discipline's approach to educational theory. Now, the reason that I started to question its validity, I can only clarify in 1983 when Paul Hurst, one of the proponents of the discipline's approach, acknowledged this mistake. He said that a mistake in the discipline's approach was that it viewed the practical principles of people like myself who came out of the classroom and tried to explain their educational influences in their own learning and the learning of the students. He said that these practical principles were at best pragmatic maxims that only had a superficial and crude justification in practice, and that in any rationally developed theory would be replaced by principles with more theoretical justification, that is, from the disciplines of education. Now, it took me some time to recognise that this mistake, which I'd actually felt intuitively in 1971, needed a very different response than the one being offered by many academics in universities about the nature of educational theory. And I moved to the University of Bath in 1973 to see if I could help to contribute to the development of a very different form of educational theory. And gradually, I came to develop this idea of a living educational theory. And the idea of a living theory came to me having studied the work of the Russian logician called Edward Ilyenko, who in his dialectical logic asked the question, if an object exists as a living contradiction, what must the thought be that expresses it? And the significance of this question goes back to a 2,500 year history of struggles between formal and dialectical logicians. The formal logicians, grounding in the logic of Aristotle, argued that we had to eliminate contradictions from correct thought. The dialecticians argued that contradiction was at the nucleus of dialectical understandings, and if you were a formal logician, and Popper argued this, you felt that the dialecticians' theory were based on nothing better than a loose and woolly way of speaking. If you're a dialectician, you held that the formal logician was masking the contradictory nature of reality. Now, in my understandings, I started to generate explanations of my educational influences in learning, and I began to refer to these explanations as living theories. And they're very different to the kind of theories that are put forward in the disciplines of education, where the theories are always put forward in terms of conceptual abstractions, where you derive an explanation for an individual case from the general abstractions. And in my notion of a living educational theory, the explanations were generated by practitioners to explain their educational influences in their own learning, in the learning of their students and others, and in the learning of the social formations in which the inquiries were located. And this is my understanding of what I call a living educational theory. And I distinguish the individual living theory from the general idea that we're part of a movement in which, if you like, we can use the capitals living educational theory, so capital L-E-T, and we can use the small letters with a hyphen, so the living educational theory will be hyphenated to emphasize that these are the explanations that individuals are producing for their own educational influences in learning. And these are quite unique to the individual. The explanatory principles are their unique constellation of values that they use to give meaning and purpose to their lives, and we refer to those as their ontological values. Now, this idea of individuals generating their living educational theories is now spreading throughout the world. You can find examples in the Journal on Living Educational Theory, and you can also look at the theses and dissertations which are coming into universities, and you'll see many of these that were accepted in the University of Bath, and not only at the University of Bath, at other universities, in the Living Theory section of the webpage actionresearch.net. Now, I hope in this brief introduction that you'll get some understanding of the nature of living educational theory. And here is just one point, some criticisms that are often made, for example, about the subjectivity or the anecdotal nature of living educational theories. To counter these criticisms, and also to satisfy my own desire to produce rigorous and valid explanations, I use two ideas. One is about personal knowledge from Michael Polanyi, who said that we should take a decision to understand the world from our points of view, as individuals claiming originality and exercising our judgments responsibly with universal intent. So that's the idea that as an individual, and you as well, will take a responsibility, if you like, for searching for truth and also telling it truthfully. Now, the second idea related to validity comes from the sociologist Jürgen Habermas, who developed a notion of critical theory, and in a text he produced on the communication and the evolution of society, he suggested that as we come to understand each other, we make 4 validity claims of each other. And I use these 4 questions to help to strengthen the validity of living educational theories. I submit my own explanations to groups, we call them validation groups, between 3 and 9 people, or 3 or 8 people. The absolute number doesn't really matter. The key thing is that we ask people to try to help us to strengthen the comprehensibility of our explanations. We ask them, what might we do to strengthen the evidence base we use to justify the assertions or the claims that we make? We ask our validation group to really help us to extend and deepen our socio-historical and socio-cultural understandings of these influences on our practices and our writings. And the fourth question, we ask people to help us to strengthen the authenticity of our explanations in the sense that we're showing over interaction and time that we truly believe in the values that we claim to hold. And in these ways, we can meet the criticisms that we're being simply subjective or anecdotal. And we can actually use Popper's notion of intersubjective criticism to strengthen this idea of the validity of what we are actually offering. Popper claimed that we can strengthen the objectivity of our accounts by recognizing that intersubjective criticism of the kind from the validation groups helps us with this idea of the mutual rational control of critical discussion. Now, I'll just mention one other thing about the idea of living educational theories, which emerged for me in the first multimedia account I produced using digital technology in the year 2000. And since then, I've been advocating the use of visual narratives because they can help us to communicate the meanings of the energy-flowing values we use to explain the nature of our influence. And these energy-flowing values, I hope you can sense that as I'm speaking, I'm bringing an energy and also the values and the passion that I hold for educational inquiry through my body and what I'm saying. And without this visual data on this video, something would be lost, something crucial would be lost if I just tried to write it in terms of printed text. So you can find in the Living Theory section of actionresearch.net and also in the Educational Journal of Living Theories many multimedia narratives drawing on digital technology to communicate the meanings of these energy-flowing values. And you'll find, for example, in the work of Jacqueline DeLong, this emphasis on the culture of inquiry as a vital form in generating living educational theories. In the December 2013 issue of the Journal of Living Educational Theories, you'll find Liz Campbell and Kathy Griffiths talking about being loved into learning in relation to Jackie DeLong's supervision of their master's dissertations. And without the multimedia narratives, the use of the digital technology, I'm claiming that it would be very difficult indeed to communicate the meanings of these energy-flowing values, which we can use as explanatory principles in living educational theories. Now, I'll pause here because I think I've said enough just to give you a sense of some of the crucial ideas within the genre of living educational theory. But the crucial thing for the spread of these ideas is that you generate your own living educational theory in terms of an explanation of your educational influences in your own learning, in the learning of others, and in the learning of the social formations in which we live. Thank you.